The story of the railway is one of the clearest examples of human ambition meeting industrial reality. By the mid-1800s, steam locomotion had proven itself viable. Capital was available. Labor was cheap. And so, across the world, nations began laying track, connecting cities, moving coal, enabling commerce. The historical explanation is clean, logical, and well documented. Except the numbers don't quite fit. Not by a small margin. Not in one location. Across multiple continents, the scale of railway construction in certain periods exceeded, sometimes dramatically, any measurable demand that existed at the time of building. Not by a year or two. In some cases by decades. And the infrastructure that was built wasn't provisional or experimental. It was permanent, overbuilt, engineered for loads and volumes that, according to contemporary population data, had no reason to exist yet. This video explores historical interpretations and unanswered questions found in existing records. It does not present definitive conclusions. Let's begin with what the textbooks establish clearly. The first commercial steam railway opened in England in 1825, the Stockton and Darlington Line. By 1850, Britain had approximately 6,000 miles of operational track. By 1870, that number exceeded 13,000 miles. Standard history frames this as organic growth. Industry expanded, population urbanized, trade routes multiplied, and rail followed. A demand-pull model. Supply responding to need. That framework is reasonable. For certain regions, it holds. But examine the engineering specifications of stations built in the 1840s and 1850s in areas with populations under 10,000 people. These aren't small functional stops. Some feature vaulted ceilings, multi-platform layouts, stone construction far exceeding any practical justification for the traffic they would have handled for the first 30 or 40 years of their operation. Paddington Station in London, completed in 1854, was designed with a roof span of over 700 feet, a scale of architectural ambition that wasn't operationally necessary for the passenger volumes of that decade. You could explain that as Victorian ambition. Civic pride. The desire to project permanence. That explanation is available. It's frequently offered. But it becomes slightly harder to apply uniformly when the same pattern appears not just in London, not just in Britain, but in regions where civic pride had no particular audience. Remote junctions, agricultural corridors, territories where the economic activity to justify such construction wouldn't materialize for another generation. Consider the railway expansion into the American Midwest. By 1860, the United States had over 30,000 miles of track, more than the rest of the world combined. Historians attribute this to speculative investment, land grants from the federal government, and the ambition of robber baron industrialists. These are all real and documented forces. The financing mechanisms existed. The political will was present. But the geographic logic is harder to square. Large portions of the transcontinental and regional rail systems were constructed through territories with population densities that, by any standard economic model, could not support the operational costs of maintaining that infrastructure. The Central Pacific and Union Pacific lines completed their famous junction at Promontory Summit in 1869. At that moment, the territories through which hundreds of miles of track had just been laid held populations measurable in the hundreds per county, not thousands, not tens of thousands. The standard response is that the railways created the demand, that the infrastructure preceded the settlers, and the settlers followed the rail. This is a documented phenomenon. It is cited regularly by economic historians. Settlement patterns in Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakota territories do correlate with rail access. But correlation in that direction, rail arriving before people, is itself the anomaly worth examining. An infrastructure system built not to serve an existing population, but to invite one that does not yet exist, represents a different kind of decision. It represents a confidence in future volumes that exceeds what any contemporary ledger could justify. And the question that emerges slowly is whether that confidence came from projection or from something else. This is not a conclusion. It is an observation that records permit. The engineering anomalies extend beyond simple scale. Some of the earliest locomotive facilities, Roundhouses, maintenance depots, water towers, coaling stations were built at intervals and capacities suggesting anticipated traffic frequencies that the actual timetables of those early decades never achieved. A roundhouse built to accommodate 30 locomotives in a territory running 8. A station built with 6 platforms serving 2 lines with combined weekly passenger numbers that, in the first decade of operation, would have filled a single modest carriage. There are explanations: forward planning, engineering conservatism, the inflated optimism of investors who overestimated adoption rates. These are plausible. They are standard. They are also applied so uniformly across so many examples that the explanation itself begins to carry more weight than the evidence might support. When the exception appears in a dozen places, the exception may be the rule. And when the over-preparation appears with a consistency that crosses national borders, crosses decades, and crosses distinct economic systems, the question isn't whether any single case can be explained. The question is whether the pattern as a whole has been examined with the same rigor as the individual instances. Some historians have noted, without alarm, that the railway construction era represented what they call a supply push, rather than demand pull economy in infrastructure terms. The characterization is present in the literature. It is rarely treated as a central question. It tends to appear in footnotes, in the methodology sections of economic history papers, in the overlooked corners of infrastructure studies. The scale mismatch is acknowledged. It simply hasn't been treated as something that requires an answer. The tunnels are perhaps the most structurally demanding element of this. Boring through mountains or under rivers is among the most expensive and technically complex forms of construction known to 19th century engineering. Yet the earliest tunnels, the Thames Tunnel, completed in 1843, or the Hoosick Tunnel in Massachusetts, begun in 1851, were not short passages. They were major, multi-year, multi-million-dollar undertakings, built at a period when the operational railways feeding them had yet to establish the volumes that would have made the investment rational by conventional accounting. The Thames Tunnel cost the equivalent of hundreds of millions in modern terms. It opened as a pedestrian attraction because the railway connection it was designed to serve wasn't ready. It sat in that intermediate state for years. That inversion, the tunnel ready, the system not, appears more than once in the records. More than twice. And when the same inversion repeats across countries that were not in close coordination, built by engineers who left different records in different languages, the question of what was guiding the sequence becomes harder to answer with a simple reference to investor optimism. Something in the logic of that era built ahead. The question that no existing framework has cleanly answered is what it was building toward. Expand the view. Pull back from the individual case studies, from the single overbuilt station or the tunnel that waited years for its railway, and something becomes visible that is harder to dismiss as regional idiosyncrasy. The same structural characteristic appears in railway development across continental Europe, across the Russian interior, and across colonial-era infrastructure projects in territories that, by any contemporary economic measure, had no business receiving the level of engineering investment they received. This is not a claim about intention. It is a description of what the records contain. In Russia, the expansion of rail during the latter half of the 19th century presents one of the more striking examples of infrastructure preceding any identifiable demand curve. The Trans-Siberian Railway, the largest single railway construction project in recorded history, was authorized in 1891 and substantially completed by 1916. The line spans over 5,700 miles. At the time of its construction, the territories it crossed, vast stretches of Siberian interior, held population densities so low that, in purely commercial terms, the line could not have been justified by freight or passenger revenue projections for at least a generation after completion. The standard explanation is strategic and military. Russia needed to project force and administrative control across its eastern territories. The railway was statecraft, not commerce. That explanation is legitimate. It is well-sourced. But it contains within it an admission that the railway was not built to serve existing human activity. It was built to enable activity that did not yet exist, to impose a structure onto a geography that had no organic demand for it. The distinction matters less when examined as a single case. It begins to accumulate weight when the same logic, infrastructure as precondition rather than response, appears repeatedly in contexts where military strategy is not the available explanation. Germany's railway network reached 25,000 miles by 1900. The engineering standards applied to secondary and tertiary lines, lines connecting mid-sized towns to regional hubs, were, in a number of documented cases, built to specifications exceeding what the freight and passenger loads of those corridors required for decades. Bridges constructed for loads that the rolling stock of the era couldn't produce. Grading and curvature standards applied to routes where the operational speeds those standards enabled were never actually used during the first 30 years of service. Engineers overspecify. That is known. Safety margins are built into infrastructure. This is not unusual. The question is one of degree. When a safety margin is 10 or 15% above projected load, that is engineering conservatism. When infrastructure is built to 2 or 3 times the demonstrable operational requirement of its first several decades, that is a different category of decision. And some of what appears in the historical record of railway construction in this period sits in that second category. Turn now to the United States and the picture develops further. By 1890, America had over 160,000 miles of operating railway, a figure that represented approximately 40% of the world's total track. The growth between 1870 and 1890 alone added roughly 100,000 miles. That rate of construction, in raw physical terms, required a mobilization of materials, labor, surveying, and engineering coordination that contemporary accounts describe in superlatives. What is less frequently examined is the utilization data. A significant portion of the lines constructed during the boom decades of the 1870s and 1880s were, within years of their completion, operating at a fraction of their design capacity. Some failed commercially within a decade. The historical explanation frames this as speculative overbuilding. Investors miscalculated, competition destroyed margins, certain corridors proved economically non-viable. This is accurate for many individual cases. But the physical infrastructure remained. The grading, the bridges, the tunnels, the stations. The investment in permanent earthworks and stone construction did not disappear when the operating companies went bankrupt. The infrastructure outlasted the economic rationale that was offered for it. In some corridors, lines built in the 1880s for anticipated volumes that never arrived began serving those volumes, but 60 or 70 years later, in the mid-20th century, the infrastructure was correct. The timing was off. That phrase, the infrastructure was correct, the timing was off, appears in different forms in various infrastructure history studies. It is used to describe cases where early construction was eventually vindicated by later demand. It is presented as evidence of visionary planning. But vision requires a source. The investors who financed these lines were working from population projections, commodity price estimates, and competitive assessments. Most of those projections, in the cases where records survive, were significantly wrong in the short and medium term. The vision, if that is what it was not grounded in the data available at the time of construction. It was grounded in something else. And that something else is rarely named directly in the historical literature. Shift to the United Kingdom, and a specific pattern emerges in the smaller gauge and branch line expansions of the 1860s and 1870s. Lines built into rural Wales, into the Scottish Highlands, into the agricultural interiors of East Anglia, regions with stable, low, and in some cases declining populations, were constructed with the same permanence, the same engineering ambition as mainline intercity routes. Cast iron and wrought iron components. Stone-built station buildings. Infrastructure meant to last a century. It lasted a century, in some cases longer. But for the first 30 to 50 years of its operation, it served communities that, by any measure, did not require that level of infrastructure. Village stations with waiting rooms built for crowds that arrived, if at all, only on market days or bank holidays. You can explain each case individually. What becomes harder, as the cases accumulate, as the pattern extends from England to Russia to the American interior, is explaining why the same characteristic appears across systems that were not coordinated, not financed by the same entities, not built by the same engineers, not guided by the same governments. The consistency is not documented as a conspiracy. It is not framed as coordination. In the mainstream historical record, it is simply described as the spirit of the age, an era of infrastructure ambition, of confidence in industrial modernity, of forward-looking capital. That framing may be sufficient, or it may be a description of the symptom rather than the cause. In recent years, and this is worth noting carefully because it sits at the edge of mainstream historical discussion, some researchers and independent analysts examining this period of railway construction have begun grouping these patterns under a broader interpretive label. Not a political label. Not an economic one. A geographic and civilizational one. That label, and what it implies about the world these railways may have been built to serve, will require some care to examine accurately. The label is Tartaria. It is important to be precise about what that word means in this context, and what it does not mean. In historical cartography, Tartaria, or Tartary, appears on European maps from roughly the 14th through the 18th centuries as a geographic designation for a vast interior region of Eurasia, stretching, depending on the map and the era, from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific, encompassing what is now Russia, Central Asia, Mongolia, and parts of China. It was not a unified political entity in the way that France or the Ottoman Empire designated states. It was a regional label, imprecise, applied by European cartographers to territory they understood poorly and administered not at all. By the 19th century, the label had largely disappeared from maps. The territories it had designated were absorbed into the expanding Russian Empire, into Qing dynasty China, into the administrative frameworks of European colonial geography. The word retreated into historical cartography, into specialist discussions of pre-modern mapping conventions. It did not remain there. In the past decade, a loose interpretive framework, found primarily in online communities, independent researchers and alternative history discussions, has revived the term. Under this framework, Tartaria is used not as a cartographic label but as a shorthand for a suggested interpretation, that the infrastructure anomalies examined in this video, and others like them, are the remnants of a prior civilization or organizational system whose scale and geographic reach exceeded what conventional history records. This video is not endorsing that interpretation. It is describing it because the description is necessary to understand why these questions have attracted the attention they have, and what the actual evidentiary basis for that attention looks like when examined carefully. Some researchers working within this framework point to the railway infrastructure patterns as one strand of a larger argument. Their position, stated neutrally, is this: if the over-prepared infrastructure of the mid to late 19th century cannot be fully explained by speculative investment, civic ambition, or military strategy, then one interpretation is that it was not built from scratch by the societies credited with building it, but rather extended, repurposed, or constructed on a foundation whose origins predate the period in which the construction is officially dated. That is a significant interpretive claim. It requires significant evidence to sustain. The evidence offered by proponents is largely architectural and structural, building styles that appear consistent across geographies, engineering achievements that seem advanced relative to the documented technological capacity of the credited era, and the scale mismatches explored throughout this video. These observations are real. The interpretive leap from observation to conclusion is where the framework becomes contested. Mainstream historians offer several counterarguments that deserve fair representation here. The first is that the human capacity for coordinated large-scale construction has been consistently underestimated by later observers. Every era tends to underestimate what prior eras could accomplish with available materials and labor. The pyramids of Egypt, the Roman road network, the Gothic cathedrals of medieval Europe, all of these seemed, to later generations, improbable given what was known of the technologies available. All were eventually explained through detailed archaeological and historical research. The impulse to attribute anomalous construction to unknown prior civilizations, historians argue, reflects a bias against the demonstrated ingenuity of historical human labor. That counterargument is substantive. The second counterargument is that the consistency of architectural and engineering styles across distant regions in the 19th century reflects not a shared origin, but a shared transmission. Pattern books, engineering manuals, professional associations, and the movement of trained engineers across national borders. A railway station in a mid-sized Russian city and a railway station in a mid-sized American city may look structurally similar not because they were built by the same civilization, but because the engineers who designed them trained in the same tradition, read the same texts, and applied the same professional standards. This explanation is also substantive. It is well documented. The third counterargument addresses the timing anomaly directly. Infrastructure that precedes demand is not, historians argue, evidence of an unknown prior civilization. It is evidence of the speculative and aspirational character of 19th century capital. Railway investors were not building for the present. They were betting on the future. Some bets failed. Some were vindicated decades later. The temporal mismatch between construction and demand is, in this reading, a feature of capitalist investment logic, not an archaeological mystery. Each of these counterarguments has merit. Each addresses a real dimension of the anomaly. What none of them fully resolves, and this is where the interpretive tension sits, is the cumulative consistency of the pattern. Individual anomalies can be explained individually, but a methodology that explains every instance of over-prepared infrastructure as speculative investment, every architectural similarity as shared professional tradition, and every timing mismatch as the normal risk profile of Victorian capital, without ever asking whether the accumulation of these explanations points toward something structural, may itself be a form of selective examination. That observation is not a conclusion. It is a methodological note. The Tartaria framework, whatever its evidentiary weaknesses, is performing a particular function in contemporary historical discussion. It is aggregating anomalies that the mainstream record treats as isolated and providing them with a unified interpretive frame. The frame may be wrong. The questions it is organizing are drawn from real records. And that distinction, between the validity of the questions and the validity of the proposed answers, is one that serious historical inquiry has not yet fully addressed. The anomalies examined in this video appear in peer-reviewed infrastructure histories, in railway engineering archives, in demographic records that are publicly available. They are not fabricated. They are selected and arranged in a way that conventional history does not typically arrange them. Whether that arrangement reveals something, or merely creates the impression of something, is a question the existing literature has not answered. Not because the answer is being withheld, but because, in many cases, the question has not yet been formally asked. The railways were built. They were built at a scale that took generations to fill. They were built with a permanence that outlasted the economic logic offered for them. And somewhere in the gap between what was built and what the documented world of that era needed, the records go quiet in a way that is difficult to explain and equally difficult to ignore.